So welcome to the session of the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. I am Neringa Kalpokas, Director of ATLAS.ti, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to this series of webinars that are organized by the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and sponsored by ATLAS.ti, Software for Qualitative Data Analysis. The objective of this webinar series is to offer insights, innovative approaches and practices in qualitative data analysis with ATLAS.ti and in qualitative methods in general. We strongly believe that sponsoring this initiative can help reach people all around the world, democratize knowledge, and help researchers by providing these sessions for free. I want to express my gratitude to Professor Emerita Karin Olson, who came to us several years ago with this brilliant idea to launch this project. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the leader of the International Qualitative Research Toolkit, Professor Olson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karin Olson, and I am based at the International Qualitative Research Toolkit at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. I respectfully acknowledge the Sioux Nation and their peoples in whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Elizabeth Cramer. Elizabeth, if you could please go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we're looking forward very much to your comments today.
All right, well, while we swap screens here, let me know when you can see my screen. Let's see, where did it go? Wait a second, let me just. All right, can you see my slides?
No.
Okay, let me go back. We just practiced this, so I should be able to share.
There,
how about now?
There it comes. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. By way of introduction, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. Like Karen, I am retired. I had no intention when I retired. I didn't really retire because I wanted to stop working. I actually retired because someone convinced me I could write more. So that turned out to be the case. So I spent about 35 years in academia. And when I go to the second slide, let me talk just a little bit about my expertise and what I bring to you today in terms of background when I talk about misperceptions. I did a lot of things prior to this, but I started teaching mixed methods at the same time, the same year that the Journal of Mixed Methods was launched, which is 2007. So I was teaching mixed methods consistently, and then in 2013, I started my textbook, An Introduction to Mixed Methods Research. And since then, I don't know if this is wise or not, but I have really I have exclusively focused on mixed methods. And I would describe myself as someone who has read widely in the field, and written widely in the field. So when I bring the topic of misperceptions to you, I don't come with a single perspective. I don't advocate a single position. My position is more inclusive. I also taught, these are all graduate level courses. I taught an advanced qualitative course in grounded theory. Hence, my last book sort of brings my mixed method hat and my grounded theory hat together and argues that the two methodological frameworks are quite compatible. So I give you that just by way of a little background. These is a broad category of misperceptions I'm going to talk about. And the last slide, and I understand you can get the slide, has a comment next to each one of these misperceptions. Now, there's a little bit of a trick here because one of these is not a misperception. So I ask you to look at the 5 and start thinking about which one is probably accurate rather than more inaccurate than accurate. So first I want to talk about the idea that is a new methodology. It's certainly, I think, a very exciting methodology. I want to secondly address the very persistent concern that mixed methods is mixing paradigms. Third, I want to tackle the topic that mixed method is quant dominant, quantitative dominant, and has tended to trivialize Qual, and a very important criticism, I think. Fourth, that the Qual and quant strands are necessarily executed independently for reasons of mainly paradigm. And finally, that you can judge quality simply by, you can confirm quality by picking a traditional design. So keep those 5 things in mind and the one you think is inaccurate. So let me look at the perception that mixed methods is a new methodology. And what I'm saying in this slide is that it's not as much a new methodology as it is one that is just recently, and I'll talk about this slide, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, the habit of labeling research as mixed methods has changed. So this is a graph from an article that I showed the site in the circle from 2019, a very ambitious study that's looking like at all publications indexed by the Web of Science. And in the bottom, you see the timeline of what percentage of publications were mixed methods starting in 1990, just shortly after it became formalized, to the present of 2016. You see a fairly low profile until about 26, and then that big upwards switch in about 206. So these findings are a little bit conflated by the issue of labeling. I mentioned that a lot of research that combined qualitative and quantitative methods wasn't labeled mixed methods until really much more recently, but that's still 10 years ago. So when you look at definitions of mixed methods research, there's 3 components, and what all definitions share is these 3 components: that there's a qual component, a quant component, and that you somehow mix them. Take the mixing out and you have multi-method. So take the mixing out, drop it out, you have a quant component and a qual component, but no intent to bring them together in meaningful ways, then that's best labeled as multi-method, as could be multiple quals or multiple quants. Where the definitions of mixed methods vary by the authors and the time it was written is what they conceive to be mixed. So in the beginning, the early definitions, the idea was you mix raw data, which is a little bit problematic. Some people find it very problematic. More current definitions are very expansive about what is mixed. And Jennifer Green, hopefully someone familiar to you, really rose out of the evaluation movement. She started in 2007 with a very broad definition that it said it could be mixing theoretical perspectives. It could be mixing the results from quant analysis or qual analysis. It could be mixing different viewpoints. So it's a more expansive definition that extends beyond just the idea of mixing data, is a more contemporary approach to how it's defined. Usually one of the first things that comes up, and since I guess it's a while ago since it's been Halloween in the United States, but those are little ghost figures. Always present, I'll say, when there are quant members of the audience or positivist members of the audience, is the idea, the unease that marked the first days of the movement in the late 80s, that it's mixing, that qual is one paradigm and quant is another, and that mixing the two is not possible because they are inherently incompatible. An extension of that argument is that since, an argument I don't believe, that since they're incompatible, one must be dominant. The whole idea that a method, so mixed methods is a method, grounded theory is a method, that a method has a paradigm, to me, is a fallacious one. So a method is a tool. There are guidelines to use the tool. You can use the tool with different paradigms. So mixed methods, like many qual traditions, has been used with constructivism, postmodernism, postcolonialism, participatory action research. So as a method, it's adaptable to different paradigms. And I summarize those briefly. What I don't believe is possible is that one person can manifest more than one paradigm. So paradigms are kind of like the cultural, I'm going to go here and then I'll come back. Paradigms are like the cultural milieu in which we're trained. So you see in this slide right now to the far right, the paradigmatic priorities are culturally are changing, with much more interest in critical race theory, post-colonial theory, indigenous cultures. That's the social milieu of a paradigm. Most of us who are retired now, trained in the 80s, over here somewhere, where we were trained in positivism. We were trained in quant methods. We were trained there's a truth and you can find the truth, and that's part of the positivist. Most people who continue to self-educate have moved since our training days in the 80s, have moved to adopt other paradigms, but really I always feel like I have multiple paradigms. So I'm interested, I share assumptions of pragmatism, I share assumptions of constructivism, not so much into relativism. I'm very much in the postmodern perspective about there being multiple truths. So not only do I not believe that a method has a paradigm, I don't think individuals who think complexly about these phenomena really exist solely within one paradigm. As I said, I think I branch multiple paradigms. So the previous slide, going kind of backwards, and I want to say about the previous slide that people who started writing textbooks about mixed methods in the late 80s, which was really when mixed methods started to be formalized. Qualitative had been around a little while, quantitative had been around as the official paradigm for a long time. The late 80s, when it was beginning to ferment the idea that it was its own distinct method and methodology. And I was making the point that it is used with many paradigms, and I list 5 of them here. From constructivism, and you see the same division, you see the same, not division, the same shifts in thinking within the grounded theory movement. So I've seen people take the founders of grounded theory, which I'm not trying to do for mixed methods yet, and they position it as starting as positivists in the 60s, moving to post-positivism with Strauss. Kathy Sharmez in grounded theory is very well known for introducing a constructivist perspective. Morgan talks about a pragmatic perspective to grounded theory, and Clark specializes in postmodern. Now, why am I talking about grounded theory when I'm talking about mixed methods? I'm underscoring 2 points. One, that it can be approached from many paradigms. 2, I don't think people can operate simultaneously from multiple paradigms, even though these overlap to some extent, and that people's paradigms shift. So for instance, I remember vividly Donna Mertens, who has really made a name for herself as in mixed methods in this group, the feminist agenda that she calls a transformative agenda. When she speaks to groups, she says, I started writing about mixed methods in the 80s. I continue to grow and learn. Methodologies change. What I said in the 80s maybe not be exactly what I think now. So really saying, can't freeze a method into the way it was first conceived, because when they were first conceived, they were still a positivist perspective about the right and wrong. Now, shifting to one of the other misperceptions, this is the one that I think is correct and is not a misperception. So Giddings charged, and let's see, I forgot, 206. So 206, not so far, 10 years into the mixed methods movement, if you put 88 as the triggering year when it was first starting to appear as separate textbooks, he used the word positivism and drag as mixed methods. That is really the positivist orientation, the quantitative, if you'll make that simplistic assumption, was really the predominant way of thinking. I call it a wolf in sheep's clothing, and I think this is a cute little picture I got from Shutterstock. So the idea that qualitative has been downplayed in mixed methods, I think that is true. I think it's less true now, in 2022, than certainly in the 90s and the 10 years following that. So what does mixed methods in drag look like? It tries to make Qual, in my opinion, quant. It gives attention, or says it has a qualitative component, but the qualitative component is trivialized. And there's ample evidence of this. There's been ample studies that have documented that most mixed method studies are quant dominated until recently. So when I say it trivializes Qual, I'll give you 2 examples of what I think is trivializing Qual to an extent that I question if it's legitimately qual. One is to turn qual data simply into quant. So let's say a study that is based on web material that appears on the internet. Takes those words, does frequency counts, does a Wordle type activity, identifies the most common words by counting, no further analysis beyond that. So I used to joke that mixed methods was an excuse to count qual, but that was in my own earlier days when I myself was post-positivist. So turning qual into quant and stopping there is trivializing qual. Now, if you go on and do more thoughtful analysis and take advantage of some thematic analysis or other approaches, phenomenological or discourse, that's a different matter. But when you stop at counting, even though Amaguzzi calls that crossover analysis and awards legitimacy to it, it's not accepting the foundational assumptions of qual. More commonly, you see in still quant dominant disciplines. So for instance, in the health sciences, which probably most of you are familiar with, if not in some fields of psychology, they're still questioning if qual is legitimate, certainly not a position I question. And their idea of using qual is to take major quant conclusions and sprinkle in a couple of quotes and call it mixed methods. I don't think that's good mixed methods. And to be frank, I don't think it's good. It's not good qual, it's not good mixed methods. So that could be a takeaway today in terms of the differences. So let me move to another misperception. And I see this often in self-reflective accounts when people write about their experience in doing mixed methods. They often communicate the idea that you're supposed to keep the two strands or components separate. And an attendant idea, the second idea, is that you can somehow postpone drawing inferences to the end. So let me elaborate that and then explain this figure from Tasha Corey and Tedley, which was in the very early days, one of the first handbook about mixed methods research. So take the first part of this proposition that I have in gold, that they must be kept separate. When I first encountered this figure, shortly after it was published, I was qual enough at the time to think that this distinction between data collection and data analysis does not hold up to the expectations, for instance, again, with grounded theory, where the assumption is that data collection and data analysis unfold, at least in the early phases, simultaneously. So that as soon as the data are collected, often traditionally as interviews, you begin analyzing it. So I was always a bit uneasy with this distinction between data collection and data analysis, because it also overlooks the very likelihood you could be using an existing database and not collecting anything. And that a lot of people do collect all their data and then begin analyzing it, sometimes separately and sometimes not. But this is a conventional picture of what they call the most complex design, which is one that I'm interested in, but I would never portray it this way, where integration is seen as permeating different steps. But I'll show you in the next slide what I think it really looks like. So the second part of this assumption, represented in this figure and in many figures that are used to present the flowcharts of mixed methods research. They had the very positivist, post-positivist perception that you don't bring them together essentially until you're writing the discussion section of your paper. And at the end of the analysis is when you draw inferences, as if you can postpone the idea of drawing inferences to the very end, that you're just strictly doing the analysis in, quote, a very objective way, and you're really not bringing the two together until after you thoroughly analyze one and thoroughly analyze the other. And you're not even thinking about those interconnections until the very end. That was an early view. A wonderful Qual researcher, whose name you may recognize, has suggested what they refer to as a threaded analysis. Now, in this picture, I'm trying to depict what that might look like. So rather than the idea of keeping the two strands separate, what does a threaded analysis look like? So let's even be partially conventional and assume there's a team. And then in the team, there are people who recognize themselves as quant and those who recognize themselves as qual. What I want to say is, where's the person who identifies as mixed methods? But the point is, the conversation between the findings from the qual analysis and the findings from the quant analysis, strand or component, they're in conversation. So you could imagine this conversation. Let's say you're in a team meeting and the qualitative people say, and forget the separation here, they say, oh, we found something really interesting. And actually I'm showing this not as if it comes from the quantitative side, but just as equally, the qualitative people might say to the quantitative people, as an example, during the analysis phase, we found this. We found that people who benefited from the program were like this, and people who didn't benefit from the program have these characteristics. What did you find? And then the quantitative people take that finding and go back and reanalyze their data, and that this whole analytical process is far more interactive. These two are talking directly to each other through the findings that are beginning to emerge, can be tested or explored with another approach to the analysis. So you could start with separate analysis, and then you bring them together and go back for further checking. So it's questioning the assumption that they have to be kept separate, that they should be kept separate, which I do believe is a misperception. I'm watching my time here too, because I want to be sure there's time for questions. So usually also in the early literature, and this is still building on the idea of integrating, the idea that you can integrate your qualitative and quantitative approaches, which could be case study with mixed methods. It could be case study and action research with mixed methods. That you're not reserving the idea of bringing them together to the last step where you're writing up the article and you think about the commonalities and differences in the findings. But here's just an example illustrating different strategies that can be used to integrate qualitative analytical findings from qualitative analytical strategies or sampling strategies in quantitative. This is suggesting ways that it can be done at every stage of the research process, from the design to the drawing conclusions. So at the design phase, how can you integrate? You can integrate by pairing mixed methods with other methods that have compatible assumptions. I've done that with grounded theory. Quite a few people have written about using mixed methods with case studies. Some of my collaborators, friends from the Caribbean had done quite a bit of work with that, pairing it with participatory action research. So right at the beginning, you're building in the idea that the two will interact. One way you do that at the design level to encourage that interaction is to have both qualitative and quantitative data about the same constructs, rather than having quantitative data about these constructs, outcomes, and qualitative data about another. People have also integrated their data at data collection phase. So for example, traditionally, you might use quantitative data to select the qual sample, or maybe information from your qualitative data helps you pick a quant sample, or even more innovatively, you use both qualitative and quantitative indexes to pick a sample. Some good examples of that as well into sampling, to guiding sampling. During analysis, there's several procedures, and these are not misperceptions, about the way that you can mix rather than thinking, I need to postpone that to the end, which is the misperception I'm really picking on. The newest excitement really is over here in these yellow boxes on the right. The idea of constructing a figure or table, and most logically a database that juxtaposes qualitative and quantitative data on the same constructs, and then visualizes them in a figure or table. So when you do that in the mixed methods world, it's called a joint display. So that could be a figure, it could be a table, it could be a multi-layered table, a multi-layered figure. So these are procedures, they're like tools about how you can integrate, and this can become a conceptual or theoretical model. So you combine the qualitative and quantitative data to create a multi-layered conceptualization. So this isn't a complete list of ways to mix, but it does suggest that during the design phase, when you're laying out, once you've established your purpose, when you're laying things out, you can imagine if you're really, if your paradigm is compatible with the idea of mixing, you can imagine it is occurring at many phases in the research process, not simply one. So let's shift a little bit to quality. And I will be wrapping up maybe in 5 minutes here. Another misperception, I think, within the field of mixed methods, at least I know this was alive and well before the pandemic, is the idea that how do you judge the quality of mixed methods? And every method or methodology faces the same set of questions. How do you know it's good? Well, methodological transparency has been the priority in mixed methods. And my argument is that it is necessary, but by no means sufficient. So the idea is that by telling people, or being upfront in your reporting about these 6 characteristics, you have good mixed methods. What you have is good reporting that helps you judge whether the mixed methods are any good. So if the authors of a publication or report don't acknowledge these things, then there's no way an audience member can make a judgment about the quality. So this is what is in the APA guidelines. The American Psychological Association has guidelines for reporting, both qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. And then for transparency purposes, they suggest including all 6 of these items. And these are very, very helpful items in terms of cueing the reader in or the audience member in that you know something about mixed methods. So by doing these things, you're communicating to an audience, I have some expertise, and let me be sure that I include mixed methods in the title, that I explain why I use mixed methods, that in my tables and figures, I link findings to the different analytical procedures or sources of data. All of the, and then I talk about what was gained by integration. And what's behind these is really the assumption, and I think that's critical, since that mixing block is so important to mixed methods, that the section of the manuscript is devoted to integration and how that is done and what is gained by the integration is part of this kind of reflexivity. So methodological transparency is an element of reflexivity during reporting. Mixed methods community, so I'm a report from both within and outside of the mixed methods community has really equated quality in mixed methods not only with transparency, but with picking a design, a sequential design, a concurrent design, as if picking the design or picking the method indicates that you did the method or the design well, that it was executed in a rigorous and empirical manner. So the idea is that's the chief indicator of quality, that you can say, well, I did a sequential exploratory study with the first phase qualitative and the second phase quantitative. That's important for the reader to understand what you did, and that's methodological transparency. But I could have a lot of methodological transparency and have completely non-rigorous methods, or perhaps a trivial research question. So they're necessary, but you have to get into the literature about validity and credibility that exists in both qualitative and quantitative domain, so that you judge not just the process, but the product of what is produced. So even as early as my first textbook, and I say early because I started writing it in 2013, it is always, partly because in that textbook I devoted to 3 chapters to mixing, I'm always saying, like, where's the mixing? So, you have a team with a Qual person and a team with a Quant person, but no one who specializes in mixed methods. It's like, where's the mixing? Like that McDonald's commercial, you know? So most standards of quality, though this too is changing, have been happy to say that you evaluate the Qual with Qual criteria, you evaluate the Quant with Quant criteria, and what about the mixing? You know, how, with a little comment about how you evaluate the mixing, other than describing it how you did. So I think that's a very incomplete approach to quality in mixed methods, but one that is reflected in the dominant frameworks that are used to judge quality in mixed methods. One called Graham's, for example, keeps this division. So it's reinforcing the idea that the Qual and the Quant are separate, conducted by separate people. often reported separately, which sort of underplays the contribution of mixing. So to wrap up, leaving us a good time for questions, let me summarize those 5 perceptions again, and these will be in your slides so you can hold on to them. And I told you one was true and accurate and not a misperception, and that's 3. That in the past, there's ample evidence to document that mixed methods have been implemented, particularly in the health sciences, but not nursing, in a way that prioritizes quant and trivializes qual. And I'm going to say that I believe that there's plenty of evidence to support that. I think that is a fair criticism, but it's changing. It's changing as more and more people are trained, are beginning to write who actually were trained to use qualitative methods. So the 5, so that's one of them. So I introduced this idea about it not being new. I just want to say that it was originated on both sides of the Atlantic, mainly in Britain and the US. We tend only to hear the US perspective, as if it is the only perspective, but there are large differences in the priorities between a non-US approach, which is less design oriented, and the UK approach. And somewhere along about 2014, I think, or 2013, the UK and the US movements sort of split. But there's very, very vibrant mixed methods communities in many countries. So it is a global phenomenon. I talked about mixed methods as mixing paradigms. I'll just say positively, you can approach it as a pragmatist, both the qual and the quant. You can approach it as a constructivist, both the qual and the quant, in which you accept the fact that both are subjective, both involve subjective judgment. How much you engage difference is also paramount. So I said 3, so 4, qual and quant should be executed as separate strands. And I said not necessarily. Research is messy, it's complex. You get into the real world practice where you're trying to improve, say, healthcare equity, where people are not so preoccupied with paradigms. They are often mixed very thoroughly. And the last one is that we need more measures of quality. I offer some in my first book, and other people are building on that. It's not simply what is qual and what is quant, but it's also how do you judge the quality of mixing? And I would say it's related to the insight, explanatory power, validity, and credibility of the results you produce. How you produce them is an element of rigor. What you produce is an element of authenticity, credibility, trustworthiness, and then it's important to move beyond methodological transparency. So let me end there and pass it back. And I always love the questions in these webinars. So I don't know whether you want to take control, want to share, but I pass it back to you two.
Thank you very much. I would like to encourage people to formulate some questions and type them into the chat box, and then I will read them out and can combine questions that are similar. If we don't get to them all, we will copy them off the chat and send them to Elizabeth so she can add her comments in the material that's posted on the archive of ATLAS.ti and IQRT. Okay, I don't see any questions yet, Elizabeth, mostly just thank yous.
Oh.
Okay, here's the first question. Let's see. It's about using mixed methods in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary team research. The more important issue is how to ensure that team members recognize other methodological traditions and accept that they might need to move beyond their comfort zones to achieve a better impact. So
That's an important question.
yeah,
It's a perennial issue on teams. And historically, I think people are probably familiar with the situation. Historically, not in all contexts, but the qual person is often the third wheel, less resources, less time, having to sort of fight for the validity of their own conclusions. And the only way that I can suggest is a time-intensive effort. I was involved in one myself with a huge project, and it wasn't about the methodology, but it was about the content area. And we spent some time, like 1 or 2 of the first meetings, sharing, being reflexive about key elements of our methods, key elements of our approaches, so that somehow so it's kind of a collective reflexivity and sometimes a sharing of articles that means moving forward with your understanding of a methodology, because part of what I was trying to say in the paradigm section, they're not frozen in cement. I guess you don't freeze cement, but methodologies continue to evolve. So some of the criticisms that were labeled against a methodology may have been true in '88, but it may not be the dominant way the methodology is used now. So sometimes it requires updating and sharing resources in terms of support for your own position. And the same applies to graduate students. It's when you're defending your position, you have to provide evidence that their expertise, that there are people out there who back you up, who agree with your approach. And often that documentation is satisfactory to academics. I'm sure Karen has thoughts about that as well, but I think there has to be some mutual self-instruction if you're launching into a, some kind of 5-year project that's funded.
yeah. Thank you very much. We have another question here, Elizabeth, and I know this one comes up quite a bit. The question is, if my research project is using mixed methods, is it ethical to publish these findings separately and then another with both approaches integrated?
I think it is, and I think it's strategic.
So when you have one, like say the qual part informing the quant part using a threaded approach, you think you can unthread them and publish the results separately?
I'll tell you how you can do it. And you're right to raise this question. People most often dismiss this as a possibility. Let's say you have 3 research questions. You may only have 1 mixed methods research question, but say you have qual questions and you have quant questions. It's easier that way. And oftentimes in a dissertation, especially in the manuscript option that is grown to be more popular, you don't answer all your research questions. Now, the challenge is, as Karen is suggesting, how do you recognize the integration, but only report the results from one kind of data? An additional option that you have is also strictly a methodological article, which could be that 3rd article. But I think everyone has to be strategic in their publishing. So I think it can be done ethically, but it's good to be wise that you weave integration, a section on integration, into each of those papers so they're connected. rather than sort of standing out there totally separately.
Yeah. I'll just add that at QHR, where I'm one of the deputy editors, we do not accept the parts separately, simply because we have been using Morse's approach to Qual methods. So if you have primarily quant and then interviews added on, you can't just publish the interviews by themselves because they're not hooked to a design. But what I hear you saying, Elizabeth, is that one starts out with a fully formed quant study and a fully formed Qual study, and then integrates them.
Yeah, and I think, yes, it's possible to weave the integration into both.
Right.
I think part behind this is the assumption that one must be dominant.
Right.
And I have never bought that assumption, because I do think they can be equal partners.
Right. That's interesting. Very interesting. We have a question now about where one's philosophic stance fits in. It says, the question is, so our philosophic stances should not affect the methods used for research, as suggested by Saunders' Research Onion. Is that correct?
Let me see if I can precisely word. You're expected to be reflexive about it in terms of how it might influence the way you go, not only your questions, but the way you go about doing your research. And
Right.
certainly it does have a very profound effect on how you do the research.
Yeah, I think part of the confusion might be that the things that you call paradigms, so post-positivism, etc., are what some people call philosophic stance.
Yes, they're the same.
Yeah.
They're the same. Most people don't invest a lot of time when you interview, or studies showing faculty, they're not very aware of their paradigmatic positions. They're really mostly in the the pragmatic camp, in
Right.
that they're in what works for this setting, what works for this audience.
Yeah.
And they want to get the research done, and they want to do good research. But yes, it is we talk about it as paradigm because of the paradigm wars, but it is philosophical stance. You're on, yes, exactly right, Karen.
Okay. Now we have a question about whether the same paradigm can be used for both studies in a mixed methods project.
I think it always is. No, I can't say that. That's too strong. For when an individual is doing research, not on a team context, I think they're operating from one paradigm. So if I had to claim one paradigm, let's say I'd claim constructivism. Knowledge is constructed by individuals. All of us perceive the world differently. But most importantly, I'm comfortable with a constructivist approach to quant. I'm as skeptical about the numbers as I am about the text. So I bring the belief that both are highly subjective enterprises that involve judgment all along the way. And I'm not uncomfortable with that. That doesn't make it an opinion. It's still empirical. But I always have found it very ironic. You circle a number on a survey, 4, because you strongly agree, and that's objective. But you answer an open-ended question asking the same thing, and that's subjective. So I just find the objective, subjective just isn't a dichotomy that works for me.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. We have another question about whether you can use 2 Qual studies as the strands in a mixed methods project successfully.
It depends who you ask. There is support for that. I believe it's Morse that says it's
yes,
possible.
it is. Yeah.
Janice Morse, would be who you would cite if you wanted to do that. If you mix the two, so you analyze them respecting the traditions of the different qual approaches, and then you find a way to integrate it, if you're only just sorting the data by some indicators, then I believe you can. But if you were talking to a person that prescribes a conventional approach to mixed methods, they would say no. I don't agree with that, but so it's a question that requires an expert source, and Morse is your source, that it's legitimate. I believe it can be very strong mixing. I think you can integrate two sources of qualitative data. I had a student that his only data was information from websites, and he did network analysis, and conventionally they would say, if your data is words, it's qual. And if you only have words, it's qual. That's a conventional approach. So if you want to move from that and be part of the dynamism method, you cite Morse. She has a good book on mixed methods. She wrote with Niehaus, Niehus, that is still widely cited. It's not a new book, but it's still widely cited. So you find your sources that support what you want to do.
Right. Thank you. We have another question here, going back to your comment about the split between the European and US approaches. And the question is, would you say, what would you say are those major differences in focus?
Initially, the major shift in focus, from my understanding, is the UK people who were very influential, like Bryant. Anthony Bryant is one of them. Julie Brannon is another. Were qualitatively oriented long before a qualitative strength became evident in the United States. It's also been very interesting to me to travel. When I was president of the Mixed Methods International Association, I traveled to different countries. And you go to New Zealand and Australia, they're studying indigenous populations, and it's all qual. I mean, the dominant ethos is qual. You go to Japan, the dominant logic is quant. So there are different social milieus about what is accepted as the norm and what is accepted as an aberration or something. So that the emphasis on qual was the original distinction, I think. And then I don't know how the UK track and the US track became so separate. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, so that's something we can all watch for, and maybe write some articles together with colleagues, especially in the UK, about how we see the differences in the various cultures, because there are probably additional differences beyond just the UK and the US.
Right. And the first textbooks about mixed methods were from people from the UK.
Yeah.
Published in the 80s, they were from people from the UK. So mixed methods rose up in as a legitimate methodology in the UK a little bit before the US.
Right. So thank you. So here's the next question. Any advice for early career qual researchers working on mixed method studies in a positivist space?
Oh, that's a perennial issue. Cite your sources. I'm just going to say it as simply, talk like you're writing a paper and cite your sources. So even in across the table format, you become familiar with the body of literature in mixed methods that is consistent with your own priorities. And then you weave references into them throughout your conversations. as if they're your best friends. So it's not like they're dismissing you because you've made this up.
Right.
And often they're not hostile, they're just ill-informed.
Right. Okay, good answer. We can
Thank
all
you.
learn to do that better. Here's another question regarding the use of generic qualitative approach in mixed methods instead of adopting a specific qual approach. Does that affect the quality and the outcomes of the qual strand?
It's a thoughtful question. Not necessarily. As long as you're pursuing it, I want to use rigorously. I mean, you're developing, for instance, you're applying a coding scheme in a systematic way. You've collected your data in a systematic way. You're following research procedures. So I absolutely, I think most research is done that way. No, I don't think I know. In fact,
Yeah.
most mixed methods that use qualitative are not pairing it with another method. That's a good clarification question.
Yeah, I would say that in QHR, we do not publish any studies that do not use a specific qual design. So we don't publish a generic qualitative studies at all.
Interesting.
So it would depend on where a person wanted to publish, I guess. And that's because the research questions need to be stated and the design is hooked to the question. And then the analytic approaches are hooked to that. So in grounded theory, we look for what is the theory you came up with and what were the concepts you identified and what were the indicators of those concepts. So that all would have to be there for a grounded theory study.
That kind of research, and actually I think a lot of mixed methods that's not quant dominant appears in other in different qualitative journals or
Yes.
in broad social science journals, you know, the International Journal of Social Science Research Methods. So they're becoming familiar with, you know, well, whenever I pick up a publication, I always look at where it's published, and becoming familiar with a wide range of outlets is probably important.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I say that you need to think about where you want to publish your work, and then make sure that when you submit your manuscript, you take a similar approach.
That's interesting. That what you said, Karen, I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yeah, we can talk about it later. I think we have some 2 or 3 pots of tea right there.
Anytime.
Yeah, okay. One person says, I need a bit of clarity on the MMR paradigms. Does it mean there is no one definite paradigm to MMR?
Correct. So I listed, I think, 5. Initially, so the 2 probably fall under pragmatism that are probably most dominant. Burke Johnson has written about dialectical pluralism, and that is a branch of pragmatism when the intent is overt to engage diverse perspectives. So say you're working with 4 or 5 immigrant communities and you're not trying to homogenize your narrative, and you want to recognize differences between the groups. So the dialectical paradigm, and Jennifer Green wrote about this not a long time ago, but in her 207 book. So pragmatisms and offshoots of pragmatism, like dialectical pluralism, are probably the dominant paradigms. But just like grounded theory is used with different paradigms, mixed methods is definitely used with different paradigms.
Yeah. So that leads into the next question nicely. Practical tips to manage mixed methods data, sometimes coming from lots of different methods or different groups of people.
Well, ATLAS.ti will be happy at my answer on this. She'll be ready for my answer on this. As soon as you move beyond biography and phenomenology, I'm going to say, as soon as you move beyond a relatively manageable amount of data, you really need to use qualitative software. ATLAS.ti is one of them. The ability to put the data, organize it by your constructs, and to link different kinds of data through the software is beyond, I mean, it allows you to think in a dimension that you cannot think in with just words. So you can have video data, you can have social media data, you can use maps, you can code maps, you could code pictures, but the ability to look at both your different sources of data around the same question or the same construct. The software, like I said, allows you to think in a multi-level, multi-dimensional way. It's very difficult to do just on paper.
I would sure agree with you there. Thank you very much for that answer. Can we
Okay.
do one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Narita? Okay. This question is about reflexivity skills during analysis. Do they have distinct characteristics when we analyze qual versus quant? And how can we foster, reinforce, or grow this skill, particularly in young researchers?
I think even though qual researchers don't, well, this is generalizing, even though the word bias is associated with a more quantitative perspective, I think where reflexivity shares in all of the methods is this idea of resisting forcing. Forcing is a language out of grounded theory. The idea of forcing is that it's not a good thing, is you're always wanting to check through your reflexivity that you're not imposing your own perceptions and opinions on your data, and that you're able to see when your data does not support your initial expectations. So when people come out and say, well, I didn't find what I expected to find, I always take that as a good sign that you weren't forcing your preconceptions. But I think that's the heart of it. And so that's why it's endemic to them all. You're trying to be sure that you've used rigorous and that you can see data that contradicts your perspective. And I think that's part of the discussion that might go on in a team. It's part of the reflexivity. And once in a while you see someone, I just saw an article recently in a psychology journal that they started with one theoretical framework and their final figure was a quant one. And they maintained it supported their theory, but the paths were so weak that it was like, no, it didn't really support your theory. So the reflexivity is to be checking, always checking that you're not forcing your own preconceptions and values and then reporting it as if the data said that. I hope that's a
great answer. In a nutshell, my takeaway on that is that reflexivity is more or less the same in quant and qual. You just have to keep track of what your expectations were and make sure that you identify indications in the data that you might need to change your mind about things.
Yeah, and that's why you don't want to sweep the contradictions under the rug.
Yeah.
So when your data doesn't agree, or your qualitative and quant, often the qual and quant data don't agree. So it's not like you can say, oh, well, those are outliers. We won't pay attention to that.
Yeah.
I love, we'll just ignore that. It's important.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
You have to be comfortable with messiness, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you have to recognize those. Wait a minute, this data says something totally different. Now, maybe you can look at your methods and say, oh no, that instrument wasn't very good, but you need to pursue it.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth,
Early.
for a great talk. You've given all of us lots to think about. And I think it's not easy. Mixed methods research is not easy, but it's really important given the complexity of the questions that we're all dealing with now.
Well said. Well said. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your so insightful and inspirational speech. Really, I enjoyed so much. And
I'm glad.
I'm sure that all of us who were listening today and later on we will be, I'm sure, reviewing and again the recording.
So.
Definitely we got ideas for our own projects, because all of us, I believe those who are connected, they are active researchers. And as I always say, you know, through research, we can make a better world. No? So I want to express my gratitude to you, Elizabeth, to you, Karin, for moderating this session, and all of you who are participating. Thank you for your time, for being here with us today. And just keep an eye that we have a bunch of free trainings, webinars on ATLAS.ti, or how to do a literature review with ATLAS.ti. If you manage huge data, as Elizabeth mentioned, definitely it could be a good friend for your data analysis. Just keep in mind that we have really a huge variety of free resources that can help you and equip with all what you may need using the software. And once again, thank you so much.
Enjoyed it very much.
Definitely,
thank you very much.
One of the best presentations ever. Thank you so much, Karin, and thank you, Elizabeth.
All righty. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.
So inspirational. I really loved it.
Yeah. I think we still have a few people online. They're slowly.
Yeah. I'll just. Make sure that they are leaving. Bridget is here. Great.
Pardon me?
No, just Bridget was
Bridget
connected in
Smith.
this. Yeah.
Nice. Hi, Bridget.
Yeah. Who else? Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. I think that's now just you and me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So I will be very quick. Just two questions. First one, oh no, recording.